Welcome to the CEC Report. It's June 24th and I'm Robert Barwick. Welcome again, Craig Isherwood.
Thanks, Robbie. Looks like we've got a fairly dramatic presentation today.
We do, and a packed one, so let's get on with it. All right, in this week's weekly report, 1. LaRouche warns financial system could melt down by July 10. A national bank would lower water and electricity bills. Before Qantas crashes like Ansett, nationalize it. And the pharmaceutical benefits scheme budget is a license to kill. So first, LaRouche warns financial system could melt down by July 10. In a very important breaking development, LaRouche in the last few days has issued a general forecast that July 10 could be the date by which we witness an unstoppable chain reaction meltdown of the global financial system. Craig, could you please explain what LaRouche is saying here?
Well, Robert, the immediate issue for the world is the fact that we have this ginormous, this huge financial debt bubble. And what we've been seeing in Europe is it's in the process of disintegration. Mr. LaRouche has been campaigning vigorously for many years now for the introduction of the Glass-Steagall bill, the reintroduction of that bill modelled on what Franklin Delano Roosevelt did in 1933. And what this bill does, it creates a firewall. It separates the commercial banking system that's necessary for the physical economy from the investment speculative banking system, the investment bankers, merchant bankers and that sort of thing. But what's happened is that the issue at hand is that the only way that this can go through is if President Obama is impeached. And consequently, in the last couple of days, the Senate has protected the impeachment of President Obama by not moving forward on his impeachment based upon the war in Libya. Now,
which is a war that he did not seek congressional approval for.
That's right. He got about 90 days, I think it is, in which the president, after promoting some sort of war like he did with Libya, has to go to the Congress and seek approval. Now, he did this illegally. He did this in violation of the standard procedures for this sort of thing. He snubbed his nose at the Constitution, which is what President Obama does. I mean, he's considered a narcissist, he's mentally unstable, and should be removed by the 25th Amendment of the US Constitution. Mr. LaRouche has made this very clear, but instead the US has said, no, we are going to keep President Obama there, we're not going to impeach him. And then without impeaching Obama, we can't get a Glass-Steagall amendment bill through the US.
He's blocked it already twice, hasn't he?
Already twice he's blocked it, and that means that the European debt situation can't be dealt with. In other words, there's no solution. The other part of this is that you have the internal situation in the United States where nearly all, in fact all the states of the US are bankrupt because the US states can't create their own credit in order necessarily to fund their budgets. They have to raise it through taxes and they rely on federal funding to be able to survive. Now, they have to balance their budgets by 47 of the 50 states have to balance their budgets by the first week in July. And that means that if there's no way of balancing their budget, you know, they have to default, they have to declare bankruptcy, which means that, you know, you have an unprecedented situation whereby, you know, you have whole states will begin to break down. And this is another reflection of what takes place in this global disintegration. So Mr. LaRouche is saying that this would be the situation that would lead to a catastrophic global chain reaction collapse of the entire monetary and financial system, starting in the US as about, he's forecasting around about July 10th, give or take a few days.
Well, because with the crisis in Greece, which everyone recognises itself is a trigger for a world blowout, if it does, in a sense, shift the centre of gravity to the United States, that is an unstoppable problem.
Well, that's the issue.
These states going bankrupt is it's the beginning of the end of the United States as a whole. All right, well, stay tuned on more developments on that. Let's now talk about the fact that a national bank would lower water and electricity bills. So, proving again why Australia needs a national bank, Australians are being told that the steep increases we are copping in water and electricity bills are because we are investing in infrastructure. Now, this is a bizarre situation. I'll just give you the details. In Victoria, the cost, the blowout in cost for the desalination plant, which is a public-private partnership, is being blamed for driving up water bills for the average household by $120 next year and more in years after that. This is becoming a serious situation that in some places water bills are $1,200 a year, which is just unthinkable from a few years ago. Consumer Utilities Advocacy Centre Chief Joe Benvenuti told Melbourne's Herald Sun on June 21 that her organisation was worried children would be forced to go to school in dirty clothes because people won't be able to afford to use a washing machine. In terms of electricity, it's even more bizarre. The Australian Energy Regulator Chairman Andrew Reeves has demanded that power companies stop investing in infrastructure because those infrastructure investments, in order to expand their capacity, are driving up costs for consumers. So think about this. In other words, even though there's a shortage in electricity generation capacity in Australia, an actual shortage, which is why we have brownouts and blackouts during peak times consistently nowadays, and it's the consumers who cop those brownouts and blackouts, supposedly to protect those same consumers from price rises, the regulator is demanding that power companies do not expand their capacity. So Craig, this is a mess. Isn't it time we recognise that running infrastructure like a commercial business is a failed joke and return to funding our infrastructure through a national bank?
It's simply a looting operation, pure and simple. When you look at the whole issue of deregulation, privatisation, the economic rationalist policies that were brought in the 80s and the 90s, what you see is it's just an excuse to loot the public. There's no pretense about this. The corruption that goes with private companies taking over public infrastructure is horrendous, and there's no, the common argument is that public companies, like government-owned companies, can't provide infrastructure, can't provide water, can't provide power efficiently enough, therefore we have to sell them off. Complete load of rubbish. The problem we have is that when you get into this situation, which we are now, of the private shareholder value, the private shareholders and their companies competing with the public good, the idea of the general welfare, that the government is there to provide the basic economic infrastructure for the whole of society. Now that means that things like water, power, transport, health, communications and so forth should never be allowed to become part of the so-called free market process of the free market, the market forces. So what you have, this goes hand in hand, of course, with the fact that we have a global monetarist and financial system. It's a private money system run by the British Empire through its monetarist arms, and therefore you have a finance system running this, which means that these private companies can only really go to the private financiers to fund these massive infrastructure developments. So in the case of the water desal plants, you have a French company actually teamed up with Thiess Construction, has gone into a bid which is about $5.9 billion to build the desal plant. A private company into a private contract. I mean, you have commercial in confidence clauses throughout these things. You can't find out what the real cost of these things is to the public.
We, the public, are paying for it, but we're not allowed to know the details.
We have no idea what the details are, which is really an interesting point of law. We, the public, are paying for it. Why can't we find out what we are paying for, right? But see, this is all the scam. And of course, there's been figures quoted of the cost of this project as being 22, 25, 29, 30 billion, who knows what, over 20 years, because when governments enter into these private-public partnership arrangements, they have to guarantee the cash flow. So if the money isn't coming from the public, the government has to step in with taxpayers' money and meet those contract requirements. And this is the same for roads, for the toll roads. That one of the other partners for of course, the desal program is Macquarie Capital.
Oh,
so you want to talk about speculation? There you have the main problem there in terms of speculation. Now, what's the solution? The solution is you have to go back to national banking. You have to remove infrastructure from the global gambling casino of the international financial system And you have to say, well, this infrastructure is absolutely essential to create the physical wealth of the country. You don't look at it as a 5 or 7 or an 8-year turnaround in terms of profit. You have to look at these projects and amortise them over 25, 50 or 100 years. And you're looking at National Bank providing the credit in order to be able to build these things so that at the end of the period that they're built, you have an asset that credit has built.
Hang on, this sounds pretty radical. You're proposing that we build infrastructure like water systems to actually supply water, not to make a profit from.
It's a radical idea, yes. I mean,
I'm not sure how well it'll go down.
Well, one of the problems is with water systems, you can't have 2 pipes running down the street, right? So there's a monopoly, a natural monopoly by virtue of the infrastructure itself. So a government says we have to supply water, therefore we'll provide the best quality infrastructure, we'll fund it through national banking, and we'll keep competition out of it, right? Yeah, we'll provide good jobs, necessary high-paying jobs. There's a funny incident that happened in Adelaide with this Veolia water company, which was actually called United Water in Adelaide, and apparently in 1997, Adelaide was engulfed with this enormous stink, this sewage stink for months and months and months, and they couldn't get to the bottom of the problem. The company said they can't find out what the problem. So they hired an ex-public water employee who discovered that in fact there was a series of breakdowns, equipment failures in the processing of the sewage. So they found out what it was, and he made the comment this was a result of systemic underinvestment in infrastructure. And when you look at these Veolia companies and the Suez company, which is another French water company in Australia, you find out throughout the world there's these breakdowns in their ability to provide infrastructure. There's corruption like you wouldn't believe. And what's even more interesting is that the French government itself, through various investment companies, has to prop these companies up in order to keep them viable. So this is a complete fraud about the privatisation issue. It's a looting operation from day one. The solution is for people to get our book, What Australia Must Do to Survive the Depression, have a look at our national banking legislation in that, and discover that there's other solutions other than this, what is rather a short-term process at the moment. I mean, the fact is that infrastructure, this privatisation of infrastructure, this deregulation process has only been going on for about 20, 25 years. And infrastructure runs down about over that period. So what we're seeing with the rising of prices is basically a tax on the people for the infrastructure that is breaking down.
Thanks, Craig. Okay, when we return, we'll talk about how before Qantas crashes like Ansett, we should nationalise it. Welcome back to the CEC Report. So, let's talk about how before Qantas crashes like Ansett, we should nationalise it. This week, the boss of Qantas, Alan Joyce, really dramatically gave a speech at the National Press Club, where he said that Qantas could go the way of Ansett Airlines into extinction, effectively, if it doesn't restructure its international business. Now, we've just put out a press release on this, which you can see on our website. What Joyce wants to do by restructure, he means bust the unions. And he wants to knock the Qantas pilots, engineers and flight attendants down to the same conditions as Qantas's Jetstar staff. Now, when you read the details of the way Jetstar is run, it's pretty horrific. They use, in some cases, Thai-based flight attendants who they only pay a base salary of about $400 a month. When applicants apply for jobs as Qantas flight attendants Jetstar flight attendants or pilots, the applicants have to pay an interview fee for the pleasure of having an interview. Jetstar pilots have to pay out of their own pockets $33,000 for flight training, and just bizarre things like that, which is the regime that Qantas was able to do when it set up Jetstar. They would like to apply that across the whole organisation. Now, what we're witnessing, though, the general point here, is that 20 years after this company was the first Australian government asset, or effectively the first major Australian government asset to be privatised by Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, it has been run into the ground, and that's why they're talking about it going the way of Ansett. So Craig, today you've issued a call for Qantas to be renationalised. Tell us why.
Again, it's the same issue of looting, Robbie. 20 years ago, under the Hawke-Keating government, the issue was privatisation of state assets, state-owned assets. At that time, Qantas was a profitable airline. It was Australia's only international carrier. We also had Australian Airlines, the world's best, yes, Australian Airlines, or TAA as it's formerly known, which was Australia's a domestic airline, government-owned, and you had Ansett, so you had the two airline policy. It was a highly regulated system, right? What you had then is both the decision of the Hawke-Keating government, Bob Hawke, to decide to sell off as part of this big push for economic rationalism, where Qantas was allowed to, first of all, buy up Australian Airlines to get back into the domestic market, but before that, it was 25% of it was sold off to British Airways at that particular time. But what underlying all of this, Robbie, is the fact that, you know, we've heard these so-called big profits of $500 million, right? Well, that's not really a huge profit. By the time you pay tax on that, it's a couple of $100 million. 95 million of that actually was the compensation payout for that engine that blew up, right? So when you compare that to the cost of just one A380 airline, the new ones that Qantas have got, which is $330 million, you see that Qantas is running line ball. What are we going to have in this country? Are we actually going to have an airline, or are we going to allow this airline to be, in a sense, run into the ground, as you're saying, because of the costs of running it? So it comes back to the question of what we're going to be faced with most of our infrastructure. Are we going to actually have an airline, or are we going to have a water systems? Are we going to have electricity systems? And the government is going to be faced with this question of nationalising our actual assets like transport. So that's really what it comes back down to.
Which is not a defeat, because in reality the government should never have privatised in the first place.
This was a looting operation from day one, and that's what has to be recognised. Privatisation of state assets that are providing infrastructure is looting, and people have to really understand that that's in fact how it needs to be seen and has been seen right throughout history.
There are more details on this people can read in our press release that we've just issued today. So when we come back, we'll talk about the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. Welcome back. Finally, the pharmaceutical benefits scheme budget is a license to kill. When it comes to making life and death decisions, the Gillard government consistently chooses death. And the latest example of this is the way they're handling Australia's pharmaceutical benefits scheme. To save money, literally to save money, that's their only rationale, they have changed the approval process and put the final approval for listing medicines on the PBS in the hands of the Cabinet. And consequently, what has been happening with the approval process, it has become consistently delayed, deliberately delayed, as a way of smoothing out the government's budget problems. As we speak, the Federal Cabinet is currently withholding approval on 7 drugs that have been recommended by the expert committee that functions to make these recommendations of what medicines should be approved for this system. This is a crime. Craig, I've got an interesting question for you. Is there any good reason why all proven medicines shouldn't be subsidised by the PBS?
The issue comes back into money, as you said before, budgetary considerations, right? Everything is measured by how much it's going to cost the government. Well, no one's talking about how much does it cost in the lives of the people that are missing out on these medicines. And that's where the issue is. This is the typical sort of thinking that comes in with Nazi-type healthcare policies. What is the value of that life worthy to be lived? There was war crimes held on this exact subject. So no one talks about that anymore. But here you have a government that's in control of the budgetary system, and it should be providing the best possible health care for every single Australian, because the real wealth of our country belongs in what our individual citizens contribute to our economy. And if you skimp on health care and you end up with a sick or a potentially exposed population to various diseases, then you're actually running down the real wealth of your country over any length of time. See, and that's really where the tragedy and the nastiness of this government comes in. It's a Fabian socialist government. Julia Gillard is a Fabian socialist. They want to reduce the population. They've made that clear in their policies right from the word go.
See, because at a certain point, when they're the ones who keep harping on about overpopulation and that we should reduce the population, and then they come up with these types of decisions, you have to put aside any kind of illusion that this is incompetence and realise there's a deliberate streak here. And isn't it exactly a copy of what Obamacare is in the United States and what the British healthcare, National Health Service has implemented in Great Britain?
It's exactly the same thing, Robbie, because you've got to have a comparison for this, right? And I've done a fair bit of reading on Ben Chifley's life, and his ideal was a national health and medical scheme that was free, comprehensive, and of the highest technical order, that covered all those who wished to be covered with this particular type of care, and it covered both preventative and curative medicine. Take that benchmark. Now, where does that fit into the Gillard scheme of things, right? It doesn't, because it's a different idea. It's a different intention. So it always comes back to intention. And as you say, look at the Obama healthcare system, where it's cutting off certain types of aid to the disabled, to the certain age group. It measures people in what's called quality of life years. So it has a statistical calculation that it uses in order to work out how much money you're going to have spent on you if you can get access to it. This stuff is all Nazi health policies, and it's the looting process of the privatisation, free trade agenda of government since the last 25 to 30 years. It's the looting process this time in the lives of people.
The paradox is that what you said about Chifley, what he proposed that at a time when supposedly Australia was a lot poorer than it is today. Why can Chifley propose that then, yet a Labor government today claim that we're wealthy but we can't afford healthcare?
Well, there's no reason. That's the whole point. There is no reason. It's simply a political decision. It's an ideological decision based upon the idea that these Fabian socialists believe that the world's overpopulated, and that's their agenda that they're pushing. There's no reason why, with only 22 million people, we couldn't have an entirely free healthcare system where the infrastructure is funded, that is the building of hospitals, is funded by a national bank, so that you don't have to go into the private banking sector to get the billions of dollars necessary to build more hospitals. And that means that you could have a healthcare system that is focused, targeted, and supports the development of our population. You know what would be stark is if our population, if you ask the question of our population, does our government really care for them? I know what the answer is going to be. And that's the key. Does our government really care for us? And of course it doesn't. It's out there to kill us. And that's what we've proven in our policies. I think the best thing is for people to get a copy of our infrastructure report and go through what we say and really learn what's taken place with this policy of economic rationalism in health, using the case studies of Victoria and so forth, to really find out how our health system's been taken apart. And then that sort of defines what the solution is.
I think the point to be made from everything we've discussed today is what's at issue here is the whole system, the whole political economic system in Australia. That's what's got to be changed, not any one policy.
And that means people are going to have to take a deep breath and go back and understand what was being done in history. There's no rocket science here, but it's a different political intention, right? Develop the population and the creative abilities within our population.
Yep. All right, well, thanks, Craig. That's it for this week's CEC Report. Again, go to our website or call us on 1800 636 432 to get any of the materials we've mentioned here today. Get involved in the fight. We'll have upcoming interesting updates on Lord Monkton's impending visit and the climate change fight. So as of that, we'll see you next week.